Today we're going to be going through one of my undergraduate psychology assignments. I did write this one and it is one of the more final drafts that I did, so I can't find the actual one that I handed in, but this is pretty close to it. This is a typical assignment called a lab report, and if you do enroll in psychology, you're going to be doing many of these. So let's get into it. This is what a typical lab report cover page looks like. It has the running head up the top and the title just here. Then you have your name, the name of your university, and I had the word count. Sometimes you don't have to have the word count, but sometimes the teachers like it. So lab reports generally consist of 7 parts. So the title, abstract, introduction, method section, results section, discussion, and your references. To get good marks, you'll need attention to detail. You want to follow the APA writing style down to a T. You want to include all relevant points under each of the title, abstract, introduction section. If you miss points, you're going to get marked down. C, you need to be able to see how prior studies support what it is that you're writing about. You're not going to be told this, you're just going to be given a few studies, and then you're going to need to show that you understand how these all fit together and back what it is that you're currently writing about. But then you also need to show that you can see how your study differs from these other prior studies as well, so how your study is filling the gap in the literature. You're going to want to know how to interpret the statistics, and you're going to need to come up with plausible ideas to support the findings of the results. So these are things that aren't out there. These will be new things, so that you can't just go onto Google and look up the answers to these things. You're going to have to come up with them yourself. So let's get into it. So this is the abstract. This comes at the very beginning, and it's a very brief summary of your whole study. So this one I had to be less than 150 words. They don't normally have to be less than 150 words, but this was a requirement of this particular assignment, and that is very short. So I jumped straight into the aim because I just didn't have any other words to play around with, why it was important that we research this. So I jumped into the aim. The study was to evaluate whether users of ecstasy would score higher on rash impulsivity and sensitivity to reward, as well as whether RI and SI would predict frequency of ecstasy use. Then I just quickly state, so that's all one sentence, then I quickly state the participants, describe them in one sentence, in another sentence I show what it is that we ask the participants to do. Then I use 2 sentences here to explain the findings, and then 1 sentence here to talk about the implications of those findings. So what those findings actually meant. So this is where you'll restate the title here. Oops, go away. You'll restate the title, just like that in the center of the page, and then you'll jump straight into your introduction. So your introduction doesn't have the words introduction up there, you just jump straight in. So I start with saying that ecstasy use is serious and this is why I'm researching it. So I basically use all that to say that it's serious and talk about it in Australian individuals, because I'm at an Australian university and we're using Australian sample, so it's important that I talk about it in Australia. And then I say that it is exceedingly common in university students, particularly undergraduates. So I'm linking that back to our sample that we will be using in our study. Then I've got ecstasy use has been consistently linked to impulsivity. So then I'm giving sort of that background into why I'm talking about impulsivity in regards to ecstasy use, giving the definition of impulsivity, and talking about how it's sort of broken up into other little subsections. So risk-taking, sensation-seeking, reward sensitivity, and then talking about how some studies have divided it and shown that these really fall under two different variables, under rash impulsivity and sensitivity to reward. So together they make up impulsivity. And so then I talk about rash impulsivity, and I describe that a bit further. And then I talk about sensitivity to reward, and then I'll talk about that a bit more, give a definition of that, and talk about it in regards to drugs. So, and then I state, whilst neurobiological and factor analytic studies provide evidence that impulsivity is bidimensional, past research on ecstasy use has only measured impulsivity along one of these dimensions, along the rash impulsivity dimension. So basically I'm talking about there's a gap in the literature here. It's been measured along rash impulsivity, but it hasn't been measured along the sensitivity to reward dimension. So, and then I talk about some other studies. So these people use categorical and continuous measure of ecstasy use. What they found, low and high ecstasy groups had significantly higher levels of impulsiveness than the non-drug control group. Impulsiveness was also positively correlated with the amount of ecstasy use and number taken. However, this correlation included only ecstasy use and cannot therefore be generalized to the non-drug using population. So this is another gap in the literature, saying that they didn't have, a control condition, essentially. I didn't have a condition where we can say that this is any different from normal people. Then I talk about another study and sort of relate it back to the previous study there, and saying, however, unlike them, they report no significant differences in impulsivity in light ecstasy users compared to the control group and heavy ecstasy users. Therefore, the findings may differ depending on the sample and the choice of categorical or continuous measures of ecstasy use. All of this is giving a foundation of what the current literature out there is saying and any of the gaps in the literature. So here I state my aim. So this is at the end of the introduction section. I state my aim. The study was to evaluate whether users of ecstasy would score higher on rash impulsivity and sensitivity reward, as well as whether rash impulsivity and sensitivity reward would predict frequency of ecstasy use in Australian university students. So you can usually do that in one sentence. Then I talk about my hypotheses and ecstasy users, blah, 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 blah. And hypothesis 1 and 2, and then state hypothesis 3. Normally you wouldn't state it like hypothesis 1 and 2 and hypothesis 3. You wouldn't normally need that, but it was sort of required in this because we were undergraduate students. The teachers were really making sure we knew what our hypotheses were. So then this is the method section. You'll see here there's different types of headings. So there's the method section, the participants, and then there's a different type of heading here under materials, which is the sort of surveys that we used. So the method section is an example of, is that a level 1 or level 2 heading? I can't remember. I don't know. Let's go with level 1. And this would be a level 2 heading, and this would be a level 3 heading. So that way we just know that participants falls under the method section, and the materials also falls under the method section, and the ecstasy use falls under materials, which falls under the method section. It's just a way of organising things so it's clear. So I talk about a brief thing on participants, and I make sure I state that their ages were between this and that they were from this particular university. I talk about the ages, and I give the means and standard deviations, and you'll notice that the M and the SD are in italics. And I also break it down in terms of males and females, and also grouped according to frequency of ecstasy use, where 72 were non-users and 135 were users. Wow, interesting. I wonder if these were real results. Can't remember if this was a real study, because some of our studies we did actually provide the data for, and others the teachers just came up with the data, and yeah, I don't know, interesting. So under materials, I just give a look at the participants were asked to report how often they had used it, and then I sort of give an idea of the scores, how they were coded into zeros and ones for this particular one, and other times they'll be Likert scales, 0 to 5, 0 to 7, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's just an idea of those sort of things. So there was a few different materials that we used, and then for some reason here I've gone back to the participants. Participants were recruited from an undergraduate course offered at that university, and announcements were made at the beginning of lectures to advertise the study to students. Flyers were left at the entrance to lecture theatre, and students who were interested in participating were invited to pick up a flyer at the end of class. The flyers contain the web link. It's kind of weird how I talked about participants before and then came back to talking about them under the procedure. If I was writing this again, I would put this all under the participants. I would not put it here. The procedure's more if you're doing a longer study that involved maybe experimental conditions, and you talk specifically about how things were run, but or if there was a lot of detail on how things are run in this, it's not really needed here. So anyway, now we get into the results section. So it's a good idea to always introduce your tables before you actually present your table. So I've just said the mean, standard deviations and range of actual scores in the regression analysis are presented in table 1. So that's really good short summary of what it is that the table contains. And then I really quickly, in another one sentence, summarize the findings of that table. So I'll summarize what that table, the data in that table says. So I've got participants' averages for SR and RI were towards the lower end of the possible range of scores, whereas frequency of use was slightly above the mean possible range. So that's just a really quick summary of what this table says. So we've done 2 types of analysis here. We've done a t-test analysis and a regression analysis. The t-test is talking about users of ecstasy. We sort of predicted that users of ecstasy would score higher on RI and SR than non-users. So we use the t-test to analyse this. So we've got scores of RI indicate no significant differences between users, and I give the mean score and the standard deviation of the users group, and the non-users, then I give the mean and standard deviation of the non-users, and then followed by a comma, and then this is the statistics relating to the t-test. P greater than 0.05, so it was not significant. There was no significant difference between users and non-users. Then we've got scores on SR also showed no significant difference between users and non-users again. So the first one was talking about RI, this one is SR, and Then we've got Levine's test indicated unequal variances for both rash impulsivity and sensitivity to reward, so degrees of freedom were adjusted. I'm not sure why I've put that at the end of the analysis. Levine's test is something that you do before the t-test, so I would have put that, if I had have done this again, would have put that at the beginning and then done another paragraph saying an independent samples t-test was run. Yeah, I don't know. It's not that bad, but I don't know, a bit clunky. Then we've got regression analyses. So this is where this was relating to our hypothesis where if rash impulsivity and sensitivity to reward predict frequency of use. So anytime you're talking about prediction, you're talking about regression analyses, essentially. So standard multiple regression was conducted. So in combination, the predictors made a significant contribution to prediction of DV, accounting for approximately 23% of the variance in frequency of ecstasy use. And then we give the R-squared values and the adjusted R-squared values. I normally like to go with just the adjusted R-squared values, but anyway. And saying P less than 0.01, so yes, it was significant. And then I give beta value for both RI and SR made unique contributions, accounting for 20.7% and 2.1% of the variance in the DV. So obviously rash impulsivity was much better at predicting the frequency of use than sensitivity to reward, but they were both significant, but sensitivity to reward didn't make that much of a difference. So that's the results. Now I dive into the discussion where I restate the aim of the study. We've already stated, but it's a good idea just to refresh people's minds. I say the aim of the study, and then I jump into whether the hypotheses were supported or not supported by the results. So basically I'm saying that hypotheses 1, the first and second hypotheses, was not supported. And then I say, then you talk about whether these results are consistent with what past research would have predicted. So these results contradict past research, which found that both heavy and light ecstasy users report significantly higher. Because our results differed, then what we want to do is then go in and offer an explanation of why these results may have differed. So this isn't something that you can necessarily get right or wrong. Well, you can. Other students might come up with something different to you, but what you have to show your markers is that your account for it has to be reasonable. So I also should say that this other study also showed differences from our findings. So then I offer my explanation. So I've said the differences in findings may be due to the way in which users of ecstasy were grouped in the different studies. The present study was not divided into heavy or light users, meaning that possible significant findings between heavy and non-users may have been diluted by light users. So basically saying that light users may be more similar to the non-users category, but we had included them in the users category. So it's sort of diluting and weakening our results. So this may explain the violation of the assumption of homogeneity in both RI and SR categories, where the users groups had higher variances than non-users. So that would make sense. In support of this, the findings showed that no significant differences in impulsivity for light users compared to controls, which may be due to neurobiological pathways having been developed over prolonged drug use. So I'm offering an explanation of why hypotheses 1 and 2 weren't supported. And now I'm going to talk about the third hypothesis. Would predict frequency of ecstasy use, both uniquely and in combination, was supported. So you can generally do this in one sentence. Rash impulsivity is found to be the most important predictor of the two. This finding echoed similar results, so I'm relating it back to past results and saying what it is that they found. And because it was consistent with past results, you don't necessarily have to go into a reason why it differed, because it didn't differ. So, but I've gone into a reason why. The reason why this hypothesis was supported while the other two may lie in the style of analysis conducted. The previous hypotheses relied on categorical data with insufficient groupings. I should have said possible insufficient groupings for users, while the regression analyses measured impulsivity scores based on individual frequency of ecstasy use. Therefore, the frequency of use, and not just whether they had used, may play an important role in the relationship with impulsivity. This again highlights research showing that the neurobiological pathways in the brain associated with both types of impulsivity are built up with prolonged drug use. So then I offer a limitation. Sometimes you'll do one limitation, sometimes you'll do two. It sort of depends on your word count. I've done two here. I've tried to keep them short. So you want to talk about what the limitation is, and then you want to talk about how people could fix this in future research. So I've got one limitation was that all ecstasy users were placed under the umbrella term of users and were not categorized into light or heavy. I've said, the problem that we had with it, light users may have diluted impulsivity scores, which possibly contributed to the non-significant findings. So future studies should include adequate categories to protect against this. So it's very specific as to what future studies should do. The second limitation from this study is that no causal inferences can be made. It remains unknown whether impulsivity predates the use of ecstasy or whether ecstasy use causes impulsivity. So that wasn't really the aim of our study. So it's not so much a limitation of our study. I mean, it's a limitation, but our study didn't set out to do this, but it's important that we highlight that one thing does not cause the other, and our study does not show this. So future studies could focus on longitudinal designs to determine if this is the case. So the reason why I say longitudinal designs is that it would be unethical to do an experimental study where we say we get some people and we tell them to use ecstasy, and we get other people and we tell them not to use ecstasy, and see what happens to their brains and their levels of impulsivity. That would be unethical. But if we focus on longitudinal designs where we get a whole group of people and then we watch them over a period of time to see, who chooses to use ecstasy and who doesn't. So now I'm getting to the very end. So this is the very end. So I sort of just quickly summarize our study again and say that it's consistent with previous research linking impulsivity to ecstasy use. So there is some association. And then I talk about how it furthers the previous research. So I say it furthers previous research by showing that RI and SI are both predictors of ecstasy use frequency, with RI being the best predictor. This study also highlights the possible differences in results when studying impulsivity using categorical and continuous measures. And then I give one last sentence on where future research should concentrate their efforts. So future research should take into account that the frequency of use appears to be an important factor in the relationship between ecstasy use and impulsiveness. And that's it, essentially. Now, just looking at the references, so you center your references and you have a hanging indent for all of your references. The hanging indent is, I can see up here, it's 1 inch. And these are all, of course, in alphabetical order based on the names of the first authors. Yeah. So this is what a typical APA reference list looks like. I don't know what's going on there. That should be like that, but anyway, yeah. And that's it. If you found this video useful, please give it a like, and if you want me to go through some more of my assignments, please let me know in the comment section below.